Episode 81, When Faith Turns Fanatic, Brigham Young's Crackdown. Welcome to the Hidden and Distorted History of the Church series, where we will be looking at the historical aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. In this series, I will try and inform those unaware of the true facts of Mormon history. Recap. Last week, we dived into the devastating trek of the Martin Handcart Company, a journey marked by death, exhaustion, and reckless leadership. Brigham Young escalated the Mormon Reformation and preached blood atonement, overshadowing the very message that Jesus died for our sins. Meanwhile, Emma Smith sold off Joseph's Egyptian artifacts, and the consequences ripple across the faith. This week, William Aitken leads 300 armed ex-Mormons out of Salt Lake, fearing ambush at every turn. President Buchanan moves to confront Brigham Young and the church, while Parley P. Pratt is brutally murdered on a missionary journey. Young turns a blind eye to a bishop who committed a horrific crime and boldly declares that Utah is an independent people, no longer subject to U.S. law. We witness the horrors of the Mountain Meadow Massacre as Young eyes further western expansion in Idaho. In response to Young's defiance and illegal actions, President Buchanan orders 2,500 Army troops to intervene. You do not want to miss this episode. It's a story of faith, fanaticism, and tragedy like no other. Part 1. Brigham versus everyone else. In the spring of 1857, a man named William Aitken gathered his family, loaded his wagon, and joined a caravan of roughly 300 ex-Mormons determined to flee Utah territory. These weren't casual travelers. They were armed to the teeth. As historian Will Bagley wrote in Devil's Gate, they were all well armed and determined to get off or die. Their destination was the East. Their goal was freedom. And their greatest fear was ambush. Life in Utah under Brigham Young's theocracy had become unbearable for many. By then, dissent was seen as treason against God. The fiery sermons of the Mormon Reformation called for blood atonement, the idea that apostates might need to shed their own blood to be forgiven. Those who questioned Young's rule faced threats, shunning, or worse. Only weeks earlier, the Springville Massacre had seen several members of the parish family murdered for trying to escape. So when Aitken's group rolled out of the Salt Lake Valley, they knew the danger was real. Their wagons formed a small, defiant army of men, women, and children leaving the supposed kingdom of God on earth. The roads east were long and uncertain, but they would rather die on the plains than live another day under what they saw as religious tyranny. Their departure wasn't just a personal rebellion. It was part of a wider exodus that spring, as government officials, non-Mormon settlers, and disillusioned saints all fled the territory. Word of the unrest and these armed departures soon reached Washington, convincing President Buchanan that Brigham Young had built a state within a state, one that might need to be brought to heel by force. William Aitken's caravan made it out safely, though they traveled in constant vigilance. Their story captures a Utah simmering on the edge of open conflict, months before the U.S. Army marched toward the valley and the nation first heard whispers of the tragedy soon to unfold. In 1857, President James Buchanan stood before Congress and described a situation unlike anything else in the American frontier. Brigham Young has been both governor and superintendent of Indian affairs, he said. At the same time, head of the church. His power has been, therefore, absolute over both church and state. It was an extraordinary statement, a sitting U.S. president warning that one man had built a theocratic stronghold in the Rocky Mountains, effectively ruling a state within a state. For years, reports had been filtering east of dissent crushed, judges driven out, and federal officials unable to exercise authority in Utah. Young's dual role gave him near total control. He commanded the territorial government, directed Indian policy and trade, and ruled as prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. To Washington, it looked like open rebellion against federal sovereignty. Buchanan's remarks weren't just rhetoric, they were the justification for action. In his mind, the Mormon leadership had rejected federal authority and needed to be replaced. The move would ignite what became known as the Utah War, a tense, bloodless confrontation that nearly erupted into full-scale conflict, and pushed the Mormon people once again to the brink of isolation and siege. Part 2. Murder and Castration in the West. On May 13, 1857, one of Mormonism's most famous apostles, Parley P. Pratt, was murdered in western Arkansas by the estranged husband of his 12th plural wife. The killing sent shockwaves through both the Latter-day Saint community and the nation. Pratt wasn't just a church leader, he was one of Joseph Smith's original apostles, an early missionary, and one of the movement's most passionate defenders. But by 1857, his private life had become a flashpoint for controversy that reached far beyond the Mormon frontier. The woman at the center of it all was Eleanor McLean, who had left her non-Mormon husband, Hector McLean, after converting to the faith. She eventually became one of Pratt's plural wives, a union her husband viewed as abduction and adultery. When Pratt traveled through Arkansas on church business, McLean tracked him down. Near the town of Van Buren, McLean ambushed him, stabbed and shot him multiple times, and left him to die. Pratt reportedly lingered for a short time before succumbing to his wounds, declaring himself a martyr for his faith. To Mormons in Utah, Pratt's death became another symbol of persecution, stoking already intense anti-Gentile sentiment. To outsiders, it was a scandal that exposed the moral and legal chaos of polygamy and religious fanaticism spreading through the West. The timing couldn't have been worse. Buchanan's army was already preparing to march on Utah, and now one of Mormonism's leading voices had been killed in a fit of jealous rage tied directly to the church's most controversial practice. The murder of Parley P. Pratt marked a turning point, a collision of faith, law, and vengeance that foreshadowed the violence and paranoia soon to engulf Utah in the final turbulent months before the Mountain Meadow Massacre. In July 1857, Brigham Young wrote a chilling letter to Bishop Warren S. Snow of Manti, Utah, a letter that revealed just how far the moral order of his theocracy had decayed. Months earlier, Bishop Snow had forcibly castrated a 24-year-old man named Thomas Lewis, reportedly to stop him from courting a young woman whom the bishop himself desired. The assault was carried out under the guise of priesthood discipline, but it was nothing short of mutilation. And when word of the act began to circulate, Snow's victims and neighbors looked for justice. Instead, they got a letter from Brigham Young. Writing from Salt Lake City, the church president urged silence, not accountability. His message was brief and coldly pragmatic. Just let the matter drop and say no more about it, and it will soon die away among the people. With those words, Young signaled that the rule of law in Utah stopped at his desk. The victim, Thomas Lewis, lived, but permanently disfigured and humiliated, he soon left the territory. Warren Snow, meanwhile, continued to serve as bishop, militia leader, and civic figure without consequence. The episode, rarely mentioned in official church history, underscored the darker side of Brigham Young's frontier kingdom, a society where local leaders could wield spiritual and physical power with near-total impunity, and where even the most brutal acts could be buried with a single line from the prophet, "Just let the matter drop." Part 3. Young fought the law, and the law won. On September 6, 1857, with federal troops advancing toward Utah, Brigham Young stood before the people and made a stunning declaration. Utah was now a free and independent people, no longer bound by the laws of the United States. It was both a sermon and a defiance. Young told his followers that the U.S. government had betrayed them, that the approaching army meant to destroy their religion and their way of life. In his mind, the saints had every right to defend themselves as a sovereign nation under God. The proclamation was delivered just days after word reached Salt Lake that President Buchanan had sent an army west to install a new governor. Rather than submit, Young chose confrontation. He placed the entire territory under martial law, forbade U.S. troops or officials from entering without permission, and ordered the Nauvoo Legion, Utah's militia, to prepare to defend the canyons. Supply trains were seized, mountain passes fortified, and bridges destroyed. Young even declared that any who aided the federal troops would be treated as enemies. To outsiders, it looked like open rebellion. To Young and his followers, it was the same story they'd told for years. Persecution, exile, and now survival at all costs. The declaration marked the moment when the Mormon settlement in Utah ceased to be a territory in spirit and became a kingdom at war with the nation that had once promised it refuge. On September 11th, 1857, the Mountain Meadow Massacre unfolded, one of the darkest events in American frontier history. A wagon train of 120 men, women, and children traveling through southern Utah was ambushed and murdered in cold blood. Local Mormon men, under orders from leaders including John D. Lee, carried out the attack using deception, luring the settlers into a trap. Figures such as Milton Haight and Dame were directly involved in orchestrating the killings. The massacre was not spontaneous. It was carefully planned and executed, and it became the center of a long-running cover-up and misinformation campaign by the LDS Church, which sought to obscure the facts and protect those responsible. Historians today agree that the killings were premeditated and carried out as an act of religiously motivated violence under the authority of local Mormon leadership. For those who want the full context, including the political tension in Utah, the orders from church leaders, and the aftermath, see Episode K, The Mountain Meadow Massacre, which delves into the events and the deliberate attempt to conceal them. Part 4, When the Troops Come Marching In. In the fall of 1857, with federal troops advancing and tensions in Utah at a peak, Brigham Young traveled north into Idaho. His purpose was to explore whether the Mormon population might need to abandon the Salt Lake Valley entirely and relocate their communities farther north. This journey reflected the seriousness of the crisis. Young was considering a full-scale strategic withdrawal to preserve the people and the church from what he saw as imminent U.S. military action. He scouted potential sites for settlement, assessing resources, defensibility, and the feasibility of moving entire families and livestock. Though a complete exodus ultimately did not occur, the trip illustrates the fear, uncertainty, and preparedness that marked Utah in late 1857, as Young balanced the threats of federal intervention with his vision of maintaining Mormon autonomy. In 1857, as tensions with Utah escalated, the U.S. government dispatched 20,500 federal troops to the territory. Their mission was to reassert federal authority, install a new governor, and retake Utah from what Washington saw as Brigham Young's theocratic rule. This military expedition, later known as the Utah War, was prompted by reports that Young was openly defying federal law, ruling as both civil and religious authority, and preparing the territory to resist the U.S. government. While the Army's arrival eventually led to negotiation rather than widespread battle, its presence heightened paranoia and defensive measures among the Mormon population, contributing to the climate of fear and militarization. For more information on the Utah War, see my video Episode 1L, The Utah Massacres. On June 26, 1858, the U.S. Army Expeditionary Force entered Salt Lake City, marking the culmination of the Utah War. By this point, tensions had been simmering for nearly a year. Federal troops had been sent west to reassert authority, and Brigham Young had declared Utah essentially independent of U.S. law. The Army's arrival was largely unopposed militarily. Young had chosen to avoid open conflict, ordering his militia, the Nauvoo Legion, to harass supply lines and engage in scorched earth tactics rather than confront the troops head-on. The march through Salt Lake was a symbolic occupation. The federal government had restored its presence, but only after months of standoff, maneuvering, and brinksmanship. This entry effectively ended Utah's brief declaration of autonomy, though it left the territory deeply scarred by years of fear, militarization, and the violence of 1857-58, including the lingering shadow of the Mountain Meadow Massacre. I hope you learned something new. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and follow for more no-fluff, ex-Mormon content that cuts through the faith-promoting fog. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.